Okay, our article today is coming from the Torah.com. Professor Stefan Skorch, Martin Luther University of Halle-Wittenberg, Germany. Titled, "Do Not Cook a Kid Still Suckling Its Mother's Milk." The original biblical prohibition before it was interpreted to forbid cooking or consuming meat and milk together. By Professor Stefan Skorch. And there's a picture of a suckling lamb. The prohibition to cook and or eat meat and milk together, as codified in the Mishnah, Kulin 8:1, is ostensibly based on a phrase that appears 3 times in the Torah. Usually translated, "Do not boil a kid in its mother's milk." Twice in Exodus it appears as the latter half of a verse about the first fruit law. From Exodus 23:19, quote, "The choice first fruits of your soil you shall bring to the house, Yahweh your God." I say Yahovah. This is going to have a W in there. I'm going to say Yahweh throughout this article because these guys are rabbinical, but we can glean from them. It continues to read, in Deuteronomy, the command appears at the end of a verse forbidding the consumption of animal carcasses. What does the phrase mean? Prohibition to eat milk and meat is titled the next segment. The 2 Targums of the Land of Israel tradition translate the phrase in line with the rabbinic prohibition to mix milk and meat. And then they quote the Targum Neophiti, "My people, the children of Israel, do not cook and do not eat meat and milk mingled together." They quote the Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, "You are not permitted to cook or to eat milk and meat mingled together." The Targum Onkelos only mentions the prohibition of eating. "You shall not eat meat in milk." The Targumic rendering, going back to at least the 2nd century CE, demonstrates the link between the halakha prohibiting consuming meat with milk and the biblical passage is ancient. However, both the wording and context indicate that this is not the original meaning of the biblical text. What was this original meaning? The next topic, qualifying the verb or the object. Many understandings of the verse have been put forward by traditional and modern commentaries, from the claim of Moses Maimonides from 1138 to 1204 that it forbids the boiling of a baby goat in its mother's milk, since this was a pagan ritual. The reference is Guide of the Perplexed 3:48. To the reading of R. Joseph's Bechor Shor in the 12th century, that it means not letting a firstborn baby goat get fat on its mother's milk before offering it, and many other variations. All these interpretations see, and they have Hebrew letters there, Hebrew words. All these interpretations see those Hebrew words as an instrumental adverbial phrase qualifying the verb, and they have the Hebrew verb, "Do not cook the kid." How? In its mother's milk. In contrast, the church father Augustine of Hippo, from 354 to 430, suggested rendering the phrase "in diebus quibus lactator," quote, "in the days when it is suckled," unquote. In other words, he understands this prepositional phrase as qualifying the noun, namely, the young goat. Do not cook the goat. Which goat? The goat that is still suckling on its mother's milk. This understanding was adopted by Martin Luther in his German Bible translation of 1534. This construction, verb plus object plus prepositional phrase as qualifying a noun serving as a direct object, is well attested in biblical Hebrew. The example of 1 Kings 11:6 is given. Solomon did what was displeasing in the sight of Yahweh. Translating the verse as Augustine did fits the rules of Hebrew syntax and yields the following. A young goat which is still sustained by the milk of its mother, namely a suckling kid, shall not be boiled. The next title section is it forbidden to sacrifice a suckling kid? And it reads, this translation comes up against what at first appears to be a contradictory law earlier in the covenant collection, which describes the requirement to offer the firstborn animal to Yahweh. In Exodus 22:28 we read, "You shall not put off the skimming of the first yield of your vats. You shall give me the firstborn among your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your flocks. 7 days it shall remain with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me, unquote. Obviously, an 8-day-old kid or calf is still suckling. A variation on this law appears in the Holiness Collection, which forbids offering the young animal only during its first week of life. And they quote Leviticus 22:27. When an ox or a sheep or a goat is born, it shall stay 7 days with its mother, and from the 8th day on it shall be acceptable as an offering by fire to Yahweh. To complicate matters further, Samuel offers a suckling lamb in 1 Samuel 7:9. Thereupon Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to Yahweh. These passages, however, are referring to burnt offerings, which are not boiled. The entire animal is burnt for Yahweh, and those bringing the offering receive no share of it to eat. In contrast, the thrice-repeated law about the kid in its mother's milk specifically references boiling, and thus, if it is referring to an offering in which the worshiper receives a portion to eat. The description of the offerings at Shiloh illustrate a worshiper boiling an offering before eating it. And from 1 Samuel 2:13, this is how the priests used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a 3-pronged fork while the meat was boiling, and he would thrust it into the cauldron or the kettle or the great pot or the small cooking pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it. This was the practice at Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there, unquote. The Covenant Collection thus makes a sharp distinction. Burnt offerings, olah in Hebrew, can be taken from suckling kids, lambs, and calves, while shalamim, Hebrew shalamim, offerings, which are eaten by the worshiper, cannot. Since both references to the suckling kid law in Exodus appear shortly after the law of the pilgrimage feasts, it makes sense that the prohibition applies to the festival offering. This is when meat would have typically been eaten. The idea behind the law could be connected to the intention not to harm the relation between the parent and their kid that appears in other biblical law collections. For example, Leviticus 22:28, no animal from the herd or from the flock shall be slaughtered on the same day with its young, unquote. Animal rights could not have been the primary concern. However, since, as noted, the law was not applied to burnt offerings, the limited application of the prohibition was most probably related to the distinctiveness of the festal meal versus a normal meal. Since the annual pilgrimages, and especially the Feast of Booths, are characterized by their joyful remembering of creation and procreation, the prohibition of preparing a meal from a suckling goat at this event would be, as Menahem Haran from 1924 to 2015 of Hebrew University claimed, quote, a rather deliberate reminder of humane behavior even in the midst of general jollity. Continuing on in the section titled The Extension of the Law in Deuteronomy. While the context for the law in Exodus is sacrificial, in Deuteronomy it is general dietary prohibition. This is clear from its context. It includes a list of different kinds of meat which are not allowed for eating, including unclean birds in verses 12 to 19, and is the final clause in a verse prohibiting the meat of an animal that died of natural causes. Quoting Deuteronomy 14:21, you shall not eat anything that has died a natural death. Give it to the stranger in your community to eat, or you may sell it to a foreigner, for you are a people consecrated to Yahweh your God. Do not boil a kid still sustained by the milk of its mother. The Deuteronomist transforms the cultic prohibition in Exodus into a general dietary law. From this perspective, a suckling animal is as forbidden for eating as an animal that was found dead. This generalization of the prohibition in Deuteronomy corresponds to Deuteronomy's tendency towards, quote, secularization, for example, the centralization of the sanctuary and the creation of a general and public profane sphere, which finds also expression in the expansion of profane legislation. The next one, titled Reworking the Covenant Collections Laws. Deuteronomy's law here is part of its revision of the set of laws in Exodus 22, verses 28 to 30, dealing with firstborn animals and forbidden meat presented in inverse order. On the left, they have Exodus 22, the example A, firstborn given to Yahweh. And on the right, they have Deuteronomy 14, the carcass is not to be eaten. On the left, in Exodus 22b, it's on the 8th day. And for Deuteronomy 14, going in reverse order from D to C, it's Israelites equals the holy people. On the left, it's C for the Israelites equals the holy people. And on the right, it's B for suckling goat cannot be boiled. And finally, for D, the torn animal is not to be eaten. And on that corresponds with the Deuteronomy 14 of firstborn eaten before Yahweh. The correspondence between the torn animal law in Exodus and the carcass law in Deuteronomy is clear. And the same is true for the correspondence between the claims that Israel is a holy people. The correspondence between giving the firstborn to Yahweh in Exodus and eating the firstborn before Yahweh in Deuteronomy is also easy to see. These chiastic correspondences point to the likelihood that the remaining pair of laws are also related. Exodus says that the firstborn animal should be sacrificed on its 8th day, while Deuteronomy prohibits boiling a kid while it is still suckling, implying that the firstborn should not be brought as an offering at this early stage of its life. Indeed, this is what we see in Deuteronomy's law of the firstborn in the next chapter. Continuing on in the section titled Bringing the Firstborn Not as a Suckling, Deuteronomy presents the law of the firstborn again in more detail at the end of chapter 15. Deuteronomy 15:19, quote, "You shall consecrate to Yahweh your God all male firstlings that are born in your herd and in your flock. You must not work your firstling ox or shear your firstling sheep. You and your household shall eat it annually before Yahweh your God in the place that Yahweh will choose." The law here differs from Exodus in two major respects. The type of offering. According to Exodus, the firstborn animal is to be given to Yahweh as a burnt offering, but according to Deuteronomy is to be eaten before Yahweh, the type of sacrifice called a shalamim. When? According to Exodus, the animal should be brought 8 days after it is born. Deuteronomy doesn't specify when, instead mentioning that it should be brought to the temple yearly. As Deuteronomy's suckling kid prohibition is universal, bringing the animal would have to wait until it was weaned, much later than 8 days. Most probably, this difference is also required in light of the fact that Deuteronomy does not accept local altars, and thus the animal has to be brought to the central sanctuary, requiring a much more complicated journey. We can see the interplay of Deuteronomy's reconception of suckling kid prohibition and the command to bring the firstborn as an offering. The former is extended to an absolute prohibition applicable to sacred and secular slaughter alike, while the latter is changed from a burnt offering given only to Yahweh to the type of offering enjoyed by the worshiper, to be eaten during one of his perennial trips to the holy temple to celebrate before Yahweh. The addendum, the suckling kid prohibition in Amos. The prohibition of the suckling kid most probably left its traces in the book of Amos 2, and his remonstrance to something written in Hebrew, translated as, "Those who are at ease in Zion and confident on the hill of Samaria." Amos 6:1, in which he says, Amos 6:1, "Yet you ward off the thought of a day of woe and convene a session of lawlessness. They lie on ivory beds, lolling on their couches, feasting on lambs from the flock and on calves from the marbek." The word, in Hebrew, is rare in the Bible, but the root means bind, and on this basis it has been understood as a place of binding. For example, a place where calves were kept, and hence a stall. Since this happened in order to fatten these calves, some scholars deduce the abstract meaning fattening. A more convincing suggestion, however, is that of Helga Weipert, 1943 to 2019, who demonstrated on the basis of both philology and iconography that those Hebrew words should be understood as the binding of suckling calves to the feet of their mother. If so, then the kids Amos refers to were still bound to the feet of their mothers. For example, they were sucklings. The prophet's critique, then, may have been criticizing that these suckling kids are prepared for food. If so, this text provides an early attestation for the prohibition of the kid that is at the milk of its mother.